It is a Saturday afternoon in 1979, and a 12-year-old boy is standing at the back of a Radio Shack, in front of a wall he could stare at for an hour. The wall is covered, floor to eye level, in hundreds of small labeled drawers. Inside them are resistors, capacitors, diodes, transistors, switches, lengths of wire, the tiny building blocks of every electronic thing in the modern world. The boy has come in clutching a single crumpled dollar because the radio he is trying to build needs one specific part, and there is exactly one place in his entire town that sells it. Behind the counter is a man who, without looking anything up, knows which drawer it lives in. He pulls it open, drops a component the size of a grain of rice into a tiny envelope, charges the boy 49 cents, and then, this is the part the boy will remember 50 years later, asks what he's building and tells him how to wire it. That boy, and millions like him, would grow up to be the engineers, the programmers, the inventors of the next half-century. Radio Shack made them. And almost nobody gives Radio Shack the credit. This is the story of the forgotten genius of Radio Shack, and how it forgot itself. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand how completely Radio Shack once blanketed America. At its peak in the late 1990s, Radio Shack operated more than 7,000 stores in the United States alone, and by some counts, that gave it more individual storefronts than McDonald's. It was not in every mall. It was in every strip mall, every small-town main street, every shopping plaza in the country. One often repeated estimate captures it perfectly. At its height, 94% of all Americans lived within a 5-minute drive of a Radio Shack. Annual sales pushed past $4 billion. The little red and white sign was as much a fixture of the American landscape as a stop sign. And it sold something no other chain its size sold. While everyone else sold finished products in sealed boxes, Radio Shack sold the parts, the raw components that let an ordinary person walk in, buy a future, and solder it together at the kitchen table. That was the genius. A store that didn't just sell you the machine, it sold you the ability to build the machine. And it began, improbably, on a ship. Ask anyone who grew up before the internet what they remember about Radio Shack, and they don't describe a product, they describe a feeling. They remember the smell, a mix of solder, fresh plastic, and dust. They remember the front of the store, where the cool things lived, remote control cars, electronic keyboards, handheld TVs, Walkmans, the early computers humming on their display tables. And they remember the back, the serious end, where the drawers were, where the hobbyists went. People have described walking into a Radio Shack the way you describe walking into Disneyland as a child. For a kid who liked to take things apart, it was the most magical store in the world because it was the one place that treated curiosity as a customer. Most of all, they remember the people behind the counter because in the early days, those people were not clerks. They were technicians. Many of them could fix the thing you brought in. That single fact, knowledge behind the counter, was the soul of the company. Hold on to that. We'll watch them throw it away. Here is the claim that almost never makes it into the story of Radio Shack, even though it may be the most important thing about it. Radio Shack did more than any company on earth, more than Apple, more than IBM, to put the personal computer into the ordinary American home. That is not nostalgia talking. It was said at the time by people in the industry, and the sales numbers backed it up. While Apple was selling to enthusiasts in California and IBM was selling to corporations, Radio Shack was selling a fully assembled home computer in 7,000 strip mall stores, within a 5-minute drive of almost every family in the country. The popular history remembers Radio Shack as the place that died selling cell phone contracts and overpriced batteries. It forgets that this was once the most important consumer technology retailer in America, the on-ramp to the digital age for an entire generation. To see how a leather company from Texas pulled that off, you have to go back to a nearly bankrupt radio shop in Boston. The name itself is a clue most people never decode. In 1921, two brothers named Theodore and Milton Deutschman opened a small store and mail order operation in downtown Boston, selling equipment to amateur ham radio operators and to ships. And the name they chose was a piece of maritime slang. On a ship, the small wooden structure up on the deck that housed the radio equipment, kept separate so its electrical sparks wouldn't ignite anything, was called the RadioShack. So the company was named after the little room where a ship's radio lived. From the very beginning, the brand was about the guts of the machine, not just the polished surface. It was a store for the people who operated the equipment, not just the people who admired it. For its first 4 decades, RadioShack stayed a modest niche business serving radio hobbyists. It was respected in its corner, but small. And by the early 1960s, it was sliding toward collapse, drowning in debt, with hundreds of thousands of dollars in bills it could not collect. It needed a rescuer. The rescuer sold leather. The man who saved RadioShack did not come from electronics. He came from shoes. In Fort Worth, Texas, there was a company called the Hinckley Tandy Leather Company, which supplied leather parts and supplies to shoe repair shops. A son of the family, Charles Tandy, joined the business after the Second World War and turned out to be a retailing genius. He understood something simple and powerful. Hobbyists, people with a passion, will return to a store again and again, and they will pay for expertise and selection. He had built a leather crafting empire on that idea. By the early 1960s, he wanted to apply it to something bigger. In 1963, he bought the nearly bankrupt RadioShack chain. At that point, just a handful of failing Boston stores, for around $300,000. Within 2 years, he had it turning a profit. 10 years after that, the company was opening 2 new RadioShack stores every single working day. Charles Tandy stayed a modest man. He kept his original office and answered his own phone until the day he died, but he had just lit the fuse on a retail explosion. Tandy's real masterstroke was not the stores, it was the business model behind them. He decided that RadioShack would, wherever possible, sell its own products, designed in-house, manufactured by Tandy's own divisions, and sold under house brands like Realistic and Archer. A speaker, a cassette deck, an antenna, a cable. RadioShack made it, RadioShack stocked it, RadioShack sold it, and RadioShack kept the entire margin. This was vertical integration before the word was fashionable, and it was wildly profitable. It meant a small store with modest square footage could earn far more per square foot than a normal retailer because it wasn't splitting profits with a manufacturer. It also meant RadioShack controlled the one thing competitors couldn't copy: the parts, the drawers of components, the obscure adapters, the cables nobody else carried. That selection was the moat. Before the internet, if you needed an electronic part, RadioShack wasn't the best option, it was the only option. That moat would hold for 30 years. Then a single decision in 1977 turned the genius up to its highest setting. In 1977, RadioShack did something that, in hindsight, was historic. It released the TRS-80, one of the first mass-marketed, fully assembled personal computers in the world. This matters more than it sounds. At the time, home computers were mostly kits, boxes of parts you soldered together yourself for engineers and serious hobbyists. The TRS-80 was different. It came finished, wired, and tested. You plugged it in, and it worked. Its software was written by a tiny new company called Microsoft, founded by a young man named Bill Gates. And here is the unfair advantage. RadioShack didn't have to convince a single retailer to carry it. It already owned thousands of stores in every town in America. Overnight, the personal computer had a physical home within a 5-minute drive of almost every family in the country. Demand was so overwhelming that production backlogged for months. RadioShack sold over 200,000 of the early models in the first few years. Its own ads called it the biggest name in little computers. For millions of Americans, the first computer they ever touched, typed on, or learned to program was a TRS-80 sitting on a display table at the back of a RadioShack. That is the forgotten genius. Radio Shack didn't follow the computer age. It opened the door to it. If you were old enough, some of these will hit you like a wave. The Battery of the Month Club, that little card you carried in your wallet that got you a free battery every month just for walking in. The slogan that was everywhere, "You've got questions, we've got answers." The shelves of remote control cars and airplanes that a kid could spend the whole afternoon drooling over. The blank cassette tapes, the headphones, the obscure adapter that finally made two pieces of gear talk to each other. The musicians who went there for every audio cable in existence. The grandfather who took his grandson there to buy parts for a TV repair because the staff still knew vacuum tubes. The teenager who got his first MP3 player there, picked out by his grandmother. For a certain generation, Radio Shack isn't a company. It's a memory of a particular relative, a particular Saturday, a particular smell. If you had a Battery of the Month card, drop the year you got it. Somebody reading this had the same one. The deepest part of Radio Shack's genius can't be measured in sales. It's measured in people. Ask working engineers, programmers, ham radio operators, and inventors who came up before the internet where they got their start, and a startling number will name the same place. They got their first capacitor there, they learned to read a resistor's color bands there, they wrote their first line of code on a display computer there, while a patient employee let them stay for hours. One commenter put it plainly, if there hadn't been a Radio Shack in his hometown, he would not have become a nerd at all. Multiply that by a generation across 7,000 stores, and you get a hidden contribution to the American technology industry that no spreadsheet ever captured. Here's a strange, almost forgotten footnote of how dominant the brand was. When a company tried to launch an auto parts chain called RadioShack, Tandy sued, claiming it was writing Radio Shack's name. The auto parts company backed down and renamed itself to AutoZone. The same vertical integration genius that built Radio Shack carried the seed of its destruction. Tandy's rule was, sell our own products, control everything. With cables and speakers, that worked beautifully. With computers, it became a trap. The TRS-80 ran its own proprietary software, and as the 1980s arrived, an explosion of programs poured out for Apple and for IBM-compatible machines, and almost none of it ran on the Radio Shack computer. Serious users didn't want a machine locked into one store's ecosystem. The numbers tell the story brutally. In the early 1980s, Radio Shack held roughly 19% of the personal computer market. By 1984, it had collapsed to under 9%. The company even built a machine 3 times faster than IBM's PC, and it failed because it couldn't run the software customers actually wanted. The genius of "we make everything ourselves" had become the cage of "we're the only ones who make it." The world was moving toward open standards and outside choice. Radio Shack's entire identity was built on the opposite. It never fully recovered the lead. But the thing that truly killed Radio Shack wasn't a market share chart. It was the slow betrayal of its own soul, and the customers felt it happen. Through the 1990s and 2000s, Radio Shack chased the highest margin product it could find, cell phones and wireless contracts. The commissions were good, so the store reorganized itself around them. The parts drawers shrank to a corner. The technicians behind the counter were replaced by minimum wage clerks whose job was to sell a phone and capture your information. Customers started dreading the ritual of being asked for their name, address, and phone number just to buy a 9-volt battery. And then came the moment that, for many loyal customers, ended the relationship forever. The single most liked memory people share about Radio Shack's decline is a version of the same story. A longtime customer walks in looking for one specific electronic part, and the young employee behind the counter tells him he should go to an electronics store. That was it. That was the death. The store whose entire genius was being the electronics store, with the answers and the parts and the expert, had clerks who no longer knew it was one. By the 2010s, Radio Shack was a brand running on memory and inertia. Customers walked into stores so empty they joked that they felt like the most important customer in the world because they were the only customer in the store. The losses piled up, 11 straight quarters in the red. In a 2014 Super Bowl commercial, the company did something almost unbearably self-aware. It aired an ad in which the 1980s called and wanted their store back, gleefully letting 80s icons strip its own outdated shelves bare. It was funny. It was also a public admission that the brand knew exactly how stuck in the past it had become. It wasn't enough. On February 5, 2015, RadioShack filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and was delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. Of its roughly 4,000 stores, a couple thousand limped on as Sprint mobile outlets. 2 years later, in 2017, it filed for bankruptcy again, and nearly all the remaining stores were liquidated and closed. The store that had been within 5 minutes of every American was suddenly almost nowhere. RadioShack today is a ghost wearing a familiar name. It survives mostly as a website and a scattering of a few hundred independently owned dealer stores. The brand has been bought and sold by a string of owners. In 2023, control of the worldwide business passed to a company based in El Salvador. It had one last strange flash of life. In 2021, the brand's social media account abruptly reinvented itself as a crude, attention-grabbing cryptocurrency promoter, a desperate, undignified bid for relevance that made longtime fans wince. The store that once handed children the future was now chasing internet hype for survival. But the real legacy of RadioShack isn't on its balance sheet or its Twitter feed. It's in the world it left behind. The modern maker movement, the hobbyist electronics boom, the open-source hardware, the kids building robots and learning to code is the direct grandchild of the kid at the drawer wall in 1979. RadioShack didn't survive, but what it started absolutely did. It's tempting to say RadioShack died because technology passed it by, but that's too easy, and it's not really true. RadioShack didn't fail because it lacked the future. RadioShack was the future, earlier than almost anyone. It put the personal computer in America's living rooms. It armed a generation of engineers with parts and knowledge. It built a model so efficient it printed money for decades, and a workforce so expert that customers trusted it like a family mechanic. Then it looked at its own genius, the parts, the people, the knowledge behind the counter, decided those things were low margin and old-fashioned, and traded them away for cell phone commissions. It kept the red sign and threw out everything the sign had ever meant. The lesson is uncomfortable because it's not about technology at all. A company can survive losing a product. What it cannot survive is forgetting why people loved it in the first place. RadioShack's tragedy is that it knew the answer. It was right there on the wall, and it stopped believing in it. For most of a century, there was a store within 5 minutes of nearly every American, and at the back of it was a wall of little drawers that held the building blocks of the modern world. That store sold a boy a 49-cent part and told him how to use it. It put a finished computer on a strip mall table and let a teenager learn to program on it for free. It hired people who could fix what you brought in, who treated your curiosity as a reason to stay open. It did more than Apple and IBM to bring the computer home, and it never got the credit because the thing it was best at could not be photographed or boxed or put in the Super Bowl ad. The thing it was best at was answers, and then it stopped giving them. It traded the expert for a clerk, the parts drawer for a phone display, the answer for a sales commission. It kept the sign and lost the soul. And the moment the man behind the counter told the customer to go to an electronics store, RadioShack had already died. It just took a few more years for the lights to go off. The store is gone. The drawers are empty. But somewhere out there, the engineers it raised are still building the future it taught them to want, which may be the only monument RadioShack ever needed. If forgotten American stories like this one are worth remembering, subscribe. There's another one already waiting in the next drawer.